Hello and welcome to Pragmatic Live, Pragmatic Marketing's webinar and podcast series where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product teams. My name is Kirsten Butzo and I'm an instructor with Pragmatic Marketing, and I will be your host for today's event. Before we get started, I would just like to quickly review a couple of housekeeping items. First, a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will be available tomorrow at pragmaticmarketing.com/live, and we will send out an email with a link to this recording. Second, questions. We love questions. If you look to the right of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. Feel free to enter any questions, and we will get through as many as possible at the end of today's event. With that, let's dig into the real reason why you're joining today's webinar, and that's to discuss mastering the complex sale and how to get paid for the value you create. Before I get into the subject matter and introduce our speaker, Jeff Thull, for the day, I want to just give you a little bit of background to Pragmatic Marketing. One of the most persistent questions I hear when working with clients is, how do I create successful products and go-to-market strategies that deliver the biggest return on my investment? As experts in technology, product management, and marketing, it's Pragmatic Marketing's business to study this question. We have a rich history in helping companies succeed by implementing the Pragmatic Marketing Framework, a practical, results-driven blueprint of the 37 key activities required to bring remarkable, profitable products to the market. And to help you master these activities, we offer a comprehensive curriculum, real-world insights, and proven tools to help you succeed. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's speaker, Jeff Thull. Jeff Thull is the President and CEO of Prime Resource Group. He has designed and implemented business transformation and professional development programs for companies including Shell, Siemens, 3M, Microsoft, and many fast-track startup companies. Jeff is also the author of several best-selling books, including Mastering the Complex Sale, How to Compete and Win When the Stakes Are High. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's good to be with all of you today. Let me start out by just maybe taking us a little bit through an agenda, a bit of an overview here. I want to talk about, first of all, the three eras of selling and how selling and business development has progressed over the years, and in parallel, look at how the marketing tools and support has progressed over the years, and maybe help folks get an idea of, are they in line with the progression, what do they have, what may be missing. And then we're going to look at three challenges that I think people are seeing today, and those are decision, change, and value. In other words, we're not really talking as much today about a sales process as we are talking about guiding the customer through a decision process. And finally, how do we get the customer to really believe their business, their situation is missing the value we could provide, and then believe we have the capability of helping them achieve that value? So it's a matter of belief, and how do we guide them through that? So let's start out with the definition of what really is a complex sale, and I'm sure that definition varies across all of your minds. But I think about it first and foremost as a decision, and it's obviously a business decision in the case of a B2B sale, but it's always a personal decision, that we're always looking at this decision as to how it will affect our personal goals, be it business or personally related. Then it's probably a technical decision in the case of many of your solutions, and in the healthcare world, we can count a clinical decision as part of that. But the fundamental reason it's complex is that the customer doesn't have the capability, the experience, the background to really make this decision by themselves. They require outside assistance. And I think about that very much as the same as a doctor-patient relationship. We're all very capable people, but when it comes to that particular area of expertise, we really need a healthcare professional to help us collaborate with us as we go through it. So I want you to think about these areas of expertise where it's required, and then we're also going to think about what type of marketing support, marketing tools, collateral really are required to do each of these. So we're saying the customer needs outside assistance or expertise in the area of diagnosing their situation or diagnosing their problem, their lack of opportunity. They may not even know or recognize they have a problem. That's something we refer to as normalized pain. They think things are going quite well. They may be even improving in some of their metrics, but if you look at it in terms of what your solution can provide, there's quite a bit of a performance boost you could give them. So how do we help them diagnose and understand the exact nature of their situation? Secondly, even if they could diagnose the situation completely, they probably don't have the expertise to actually design an optimal solution. They don't know the options that are available, the alternatives. They don't know how it may interface or interact with their current situation, their current systems and processes. So they need that expertise to help design the solution. And then finally, even if they could diagnose completely and they could design the optimal solution, they may not, probably don't have the expertise to actually implement the solution effectively or optimally. They may not be able to deliver the results by themselves, and that's where things like customer success and professional services and so forth come into play. But basically thinking about how do you provide that expertise in those three areas as we proceed here. Now, taking a look at the three eras of selling, we did this survey a number of years back when we wrote the first book on Mastering the Complex Sale. And when you look at the sales in terms of the types of tools the salespeople were given, the skills they were taught, the role they were asked to perform for the company, it becomes very distinctive as you start sorting through the literature, the books, and so forth. It fell into these very interesting three piles, so to say. And we kind of start era one looking back in the middle 50s, which seems ancient, of course. But at that point in time, corporations started treating selling more professionally, more as a process, more education came around it and so forth. But the tools the salespeople were given at that time were primarily the sales script. It was, here's where I want you to go, here's what I want you to say. And if you say this, the customer might say this back to you. And if the customer says this, I want you to say that. We don't want any creativity. We don't want any thinking here. If we wanted innovative people, we would have hired someone else, as the saying goes. The skills were very much focused around presenting and, of course, closing. The ABCs of selling, always be closing. And what we wanted the salesperson to do was to be a persuader. Now, back in era one, I'd also suggest to you that value was very obvious. You typically had a solution that was very new to the marketplace, and when the customer looked at that solution, they quickly understood it could be helpful. But basically, era one was about bring and brag, show and tell, spray and pray, cram and jam, grab them by the tie, choke them till they buy. It was a very aggressive approach to selling, and it didn't take customers very long to get fairly annoyed with the whole process. That gave rise to era two, really starting around the early 60s when you saw books like Counselor Selling and Consultative Selling coming out. And the thought was we ought to be paying a little bit more attention to the customer. We ought to start listening. We ought to start asking a lot of questions, doing a needs analysis, building trust, building relationships, and be more of a problem solver. So now you saw the tools of marketing move to support those activities. So salespeople were given a list of questions to ask. They were given needs to look for. They were taught how to teach, and so forth. There's a very interesting assumption that underlies ERA 2, because when you look at those behaviors, you could easily say today, well, what's wrong with that? Why should we be changing away from those behaviors? And I will suggest we shouldn't necessarily be changing away, obviously, from the art of asking good questions and understanding a customer's needs and listening and so forth. But there's an underlying assumption in ERA 2 that I think most people, most organizations miss. And that assumption is that the customer understands the problem to be solved, and the customer understands the best way to go about solving it. Now, obviously, that assumption was very true early on in ERA 2. But as problems became more complex and solutions became more complex, that assumption begins to not hold true. And I would ask you to think about that in your own organizations with your own solutions. But if that assumption no longer holds true, then the way we approached ERA 2 becomes very inefficient. So, for example, the questions most salespeople were taught to ask were questions that were basically calling for the customer's self-diagnosis. It was questions to understand what the customer believed the problem actually was. And I wouldn't say that is something you don't want to do. The question you want to be looking at is how capable are the customers from performing a self-diagnosis. It's almost, again, if I think about doctor-patient, if I were to go in for my annual physical and the doc says, Jeff, how you doing? I'm going to say fine, because I don't want to have any problems that would cause any poking and prodding and cutting and so forth. But the doctor will kind of persist and say, well, anything concerning you, anything keeping you awake at night? And after a few of those questions, I'll probably respond something like, well, you know, I'm getting to the age where I've had a few contemporaries of mine that have had heart problems, and tragically, one of them recently just passed away, and it's like I just don't want that sort of surprise happening to me, Doc. Is there something that you could do? Is there something you could help that prevent that sort of a heart attack thing? And the doc says, well, sure, Jeff, we can do that. Tell me, you thinking about angioplasty or more towards the area of open heart surgery? Now, to me, that's the example of ERA 2, that the doc immediately is asking the patient what they think they want to do for a solution. And obviously, that patient, I'm not capable of answering that question properly. So that's really what takes us to ERA 3. If you're looking at your customer base and saying, yeah, there probably isn't a complete ability to self-diagnose or self-design or self-prescribe and deliver, then we maybe need to be looking at ERA 3. And so what we're saying in ERA 3 is the role of the sales professional is to be a source of business advantage, and what that means is how do we help that business grow? How do we help it become more profitable? In order to do that, we need to have tools to be able to diagnose. We need to be able to look at the business process analysis in a sense of how does that customer make money? What are the processes in those businesses that enable them to make money? And how does our solution specifically impact those processes? And like a doctor's diagnosis, what sort of symptoms or indicators would we expect to see that would tell us there's an inefficient process taking place? There's a lack of the value we could provide. And of course, the skill is, we're saying, the sales professional needs to understand the business. And of course,
Hey, Jeff, this is Kirsten. I just have a quick question here. I think this is really great how you break this down on a timeline and give a sense. I think of Glenn Ross, who doesn't love the scene from the movie for always be closing, moving into really thinking about how we can actually advantage a business. What do you see on the horizon for Era 4? I mean, this spans a pretty significant chunk of time. What do you see on the horizon? What's next?
Well, it's an interesting question we got from the first day we offered Era 3. Everyone wants to know what's next. One interesting thing I would say is the percentage of companies and sales professionals operating at a level of Era 3 is in the single digits of percentages. So one could argue with so few people doing it this effectively, there's plenty of room for additional performance. However, in the last few years, with the advance of technology, what I would say, Kristen, for Era 4 is to be thinking about the types of technology that can support what we're talking about here. So we're working with clients, and we're developing diagnostic tools that guide the diagnostic process, guiding the sales professional to collect those symptoms, more or less like the lab test, a medical diagnosis, or an MRI scan, and put those pieces of data into simulation technology, which really gives the customer a very clear picture of their, if you will, absence of value and the pathway through the processes and how they're going to be changed and affected by the solution. It's really giving your customer an MRI scan of their business and a before and an after projection from your solution. So that's my current answer for what does Era 4 look like, being able to apply artificial intelligence and simulation technology, things of that nature, into the process.
Great, thank you.
Sure, and so when you're looking at your current sales operations, what might you expect to see if you're operating in an Era 1 or 2 and you really should be in Era 3? And some of the things have been around for a long time, but they're very, very telling about the absence of the Era 3 approach. You're going to have a longer sales cycle. The forecasts are going to range all over the place. With that longer sales cycle and increased activity, you have a higher cost of sales. And you find yourself losing to competitors with much less valuable solutions, in the sense that the customer is not able to distinguish or understand those differences in value. And I think one of the most alarming statistics we're seeing on the increase is the number of sales opportunities that are projected to win, and they actually end up losing to no decision. In other words, the customer doesn't buy from a competitor. It doesn't buy from your organization. In fact, they do nothing. And that percentage has gone over the last 7 years from in the low 20s to the high 40 percentile. So when you think about 40 plus 50% of sales activity ending with no outcome, it's very costly. And then, of course, to compensate for all of this, we find ourselves having to discount at the 11th hour. And that kind of leads me to a question. I'd be curious as to the thoughts from the audience here. As you look at your proposals that are going out there in your sales organizations, what percentage would you say are falling into that no decision category? In other words, the customer does not make a yes or no decision within what you would consider a normal cycle time. And why don't you just jot your thoughts, just a quick number in the chat box so we can kind of see what you're all thinking.
Jeff, will people think about that and give us a little bit of feedback there? I'm assuming that there's maybe a bit of a drain on the efficiency of a sales organization when it comes to these no efficiencies. We've done all this, or no decisions. We've done all this work. We think we're going to move the ball forward, and then for some reason, just a no decision happens. What do you feel like are some of the common things that you see are a primary cause of underlying activities that lead to that no decision making on behalf of the client? I also think it's interesting we're seeing a pretty wide swing over there from 10% to 25% to 40% in the chat box. So maybe you can touch on that as well.
Yeah, well, you know, when you think about someone not comfortable making a decision, you can really go back and think about the basics. Do they not believe they have a problem? And that's a frequent cause because no one's really helped them dig into that problem in detail and determine, for example, in business, the financial impact of that problem. So they could perhaps not be feeling a strong impotence to solve any problem, and the salesperson is coming along offering a solution to someone who hasn't decided to solve a problem. Then you can also look over to the solution side and say, well, I have a problem here, but I'm looking at this solution, and I'm not sure that it would work. And if I make a decision to invest this sort of money, we're going to have to see an outcome, or my job's going to be at risk. So you're looking there at a fundamental fear of changing. That really is behind that no decision. But let's carry that question further, because I want to look at a couple of these items. And as you say, we had quite an interesting range across this. And I would suggest all of you to kind of keep thinking about how that is stacking up in your organization. And if you're probably in the 10 to 15%, it's not a problem you're going to need to solve. If it starts going beyond that 20% and up, it's a very large drain on your organization. So looking at, again, this no decision, the three challenges we see related to that. The first challenge is, in fact, the decision, and an additional reason here is the customer actually doesn't have a thorough or a cross-functional and objective process for making this sort of decision. They're very effective, successful business people, but for example, they may never have bought a sophisticated software system for their accounting, so to say. And obviously we're in our fourth, fifth generation of accounting, but the point is they may be doing this for the first time. And when they buy something, think about accounting or CRM or ERP systems. When they buy one of these sophisticated software systems, they're not likely going to make a decision on buying another one for 3, 5, 6, 10 years even. And when that decision rolls around, the people who are involved in the original decision process probably aren't around for the next generation decision. So a key question to be asking yourselves is, to what degree is your organization helping the customer through this decision process? And if you think of other professionals that we call trusted advisors, like doctors, CPAs, architects, engineers, financial advisors even, these people are all coming to their client pretty much with a well-organized decision process, and they guide their client through that decision process in a very open and objective, collaborative process. So the second challenge here is about change, and I mentioned a fear of change. So buying involves changing, and changing is very painful, and it's a fundamental tenet of human behavior that people will not change unless the pain, the discomfort, the risk, the frustration of staying the same is greater than the pain, the risk, the frustration of changing. So there's pain on both sides of that equation. And the important thing to begin to think about is this thing we call a sale. The customer is not making a decision to buy, they're really making a decision to change. And if they decide to change in a business, they're likely going to buy something to facilitate that change. So when you start thinking about your tools in terms of, is this really focused on a buying process or is it focused on a change process, it takes on a different dimension. So the customer is making a decision to change, and the third challenge is in business, that decision to change is based on the net value or net profit. We talk about value equals net profit, and we should always think about value as profit as a financial measurement. In other words, if you can't quantify the business impact, you probably shouldn't be calling this thing value. So the customer, because of the complexity, is unable to recognize and quantify the value or net profit that's at risk in their organization without your solution, and therefore is not able to really recognize the impact the solution will have post-sale. And therefore, I'm not comfortable making this decision. So to what degree are you helping the customer through this change process with your tools? To what degree are you helping them measure the value, the financial impact of your solution?
That's interesting, Jeff. We have a question from one of the participants that I think kind of lends into what you just talked about, understanding the value and helping the client understand the value. And the question was, isn't it also that the customer's not willing to pay that price for the value he sees in the solution? So I think it's a little bit of a flip of what you just said is, well, maybe he just simply doesn't see the value, or maybe the value's not there.
Well, and those are two very different things. So if the value is not there, I'm saying my solution does not have a significant business impact that would justify making the investment. And by the way, we do come across clients where we help them quantify the value, and we have to, bring them to the realization of their solution is not providing a good business return, a good business equation. Not willing to pay the price takes us into a number of categories, because again, I'm always going to say, does the customer understand the financial impact? So let's say they understand the financial impact and it's $100,000 and your solution is $200,000. That means I'm going to get a 2-year payback, and maybe that's not enough in my business, and therefore on a financial equation, I'm not willing to pay that price. Now, you could look into the common examples of vehicles and say, I understand the value of a BMW, of a Mercedes, but I'm not willing, let's go with I'm able, but I'm not willing to put that level of money into my transportation. That's just something you deal with in market segmentation of understanding who are the people that are more willing to invest that. But I think the critical point we always work on in the complex sale is that you have to help the customer clearly understand the financial impact the absence of your solution is having on their business. And we call that the cost of the problem. And
great, thank you.
If you're sitting there with the cost of the problem and the customer is saying, I'm not willing to spend that much to solve it, that's a very simple end to the conversation.
Great.
Okay, so let's take a look at, I'm not advancing here, so there we go. Thinking about this decision challenge, and what I'm laying out here is looking at a left-to-right progression through the decision process and a bottom-to-top sort of measurement of knowledge. And many times when you think about when you're engaging a customer with your tools, where are they in their decision process. And there's quite a bit of statistics that are telling us that many folks are about 60% through their decision process before they want to talk to a sales professional. And I think a very interesting question to remember here is, are they 60% through a high-quality, thorough decision process, or are they 60% through a less thorough, incomplete decision process? On the vertical axis, we're looking at what's their level of knowledge relative to the problem they have and the solution that could fit there. And just as a point of discussion, let's put a 4 up there and say they're about 40%, where 100% is they know everything they need to know to make a fully informed quality decision. So if you take a look at that as an example, you bring those two together, we're finding this particular customer has an area of comprehension of around 24% of the whole, and the whole being what's required to make a quality business decision. And so what's missing at this point, you could think of all the questions they're not asking themselves about their current situation, and the questions they're not knowing to ask a potential supplier about the solution. And so obviously the scenario here is we need to increase this area of comprehension to bring the customer to the point we discussed earlier, that they fully can understand the value that is missing and be more appreciative and interesting in making the change to invest in the value we can provide. But what happens all too frequently is at this type of a situation, the salesperson basically goes off with a premature presentation. And so you're presenting valuable solution aspects or content to a customer who doesn't have complete context as to why that's important. And that's kind of carryover from era 1 and 2.
You know, it's an interesting point that you're making, and it also leans into a question that we got in the chat group talking about the fact that we've talked about these sales eras, but is there a corresponding quote-unquote buyer era? And so the question is there not a danger of vendors attempting to change how they sell, yet buyers are not changing how they buy? And is that a challenge, and how do we reconcile that if it is?
No, it's a very important question, a very important challenge. And I'm going to talk in a moment how we address that. And of course, it's the age-old desire to call higher in an organization. But basically, if you set the proper context for the interaction, that this is not about you buying something, it's about making a decision to change. What we find with our clients is most customers recognize the inefficiencies of, let's call it the era 1 and 2 buying styles, and they're very much looking to improve that. And so when you're coming to them with an era 3 approach, we're finding the customers very receptive to that. Because here's an important question to maybe ask yourselves about your customers. Do you believe they are buying the way they buy because they've sat down and figured out this very efficient process that assures them a quality decision, or are they buying the way they buy as a reaction to how they've been sold over the years? And most people believe it's the latter, and that's probably accurate. And so they're buying as a defense against those types of inefficient sales processes. It's a great point to keep in mind. So let's take a look at the second challenge, which is the challenge of change, and looking at this from a perspective of where's the customer, where do they need to move to in order to change. So if you think about present to future, positive, negative, the point would be that most customers you're sending marketing pieces to are probably sitting in the positive present. They're pretty well content with their situation, and they're not necessarily looking to make any changes. But where would you place the content of most of our literature, our websites, our brochures and collateral and so forth, if you think about what's the content about, the aboutness is pretty much about the solution and about the future to be attained. And you obviously can judge your material, your own material for yourself according to that. But let's stay with that as sort of the majority that we're seeing out there. And essentially, the traditional direction of sales and marketing has been, I'm going to meet the customer in the positive present, and I'm going to show them a much better future. And we refer to that as a value assault. And it's back to the question earlier, the customer doesn't see the value. They may be very happy with their current situation, because if you all of a sudden start showing someone that life can be much better, yes, many people will be attracted to that, but there's a high percentage of people that, no, I don't think it will be that good. And as a matter of fact, I think there could be a lot of mistakes, a lot of disasters. I don't believe it's going to work. I understand it works for your other customers, but we are different here. And so the customer actually goes down to the negative future, basically looking at all the reasons they shouldn't buy, and you have an immediate conflict. So what we want to recommend is the journey is acknowledging the customers in the positive present. You're coming in for your annual physical, you're feeling well, you didn't come because you were ill, and the doctor begins asking questions, taking tests, and all of a sudden uncovers some negative symptoms. That it might be shortness of breath, it might be a color of the skin, it might be a new mole that you hadn't really noticed. But the doctor begins to note some evidence that the patient also recognizes, and so the patient moves from that positive present and begins to go into the negative present. And the negative present says, these are things I may not want to continue to endure. And so obviously, as the negative present gets worse, at some point the customer decides, I can't take this any longer. We're going to need to make some changes. And they decide to change right at the lower right corner there. And then the point about the negative future is that, is your customer ready for change? And most salespeople will not have that conversation at all. They will let the customer have that conversation by themselves, because the salesperson is wanting to get up to this positive future as quickly as possible to basically get to the close. And so, to give you a little more detail on this journey, we have something we call the progression to change. And what I want you to begin to think about is what are the marketing tools that you're providing in each of these areas to support each of these areas. If I look at the previous slide here, what types of tools are you providing to help the customer diagnose, to help the sales professional help the customer diagnose? And these would be the types of tools you see very common in the medical industry. They're like the 7 early warning signals of insert the major disease here. And this really should be a very critical part of any early marketing, that the customer reads through that particular brochure and notices they're experiencing these symptoms, these occurrences, these phenomena in their business. Obviously, the creator of the brochure understands this. We should be in touch with them and have them help us look at it a little more deeply. And if you think of your case studies, for example, what percentage of the content of the case study is about the positive future? What percentage is about the negative present? What you tend to see is a high percentage of the case study is about the outcome. And maybe it's 80% of the content. And what we're suggesting is that should be considered to be reduced, that the customer reads the before situation, they relate to that because that's their present. situation. And when they recognize they're in that situation and you obviously help someone out of it, now they're calling basically with, we have this problem, we have this situation, would you help us take a look at it? So it's very important to recognize, are the tools set for the stage the customer is going through? And again, the detail on this stage is a common progression to change. These are stages people go through as they go from being very satisfied, there's no way I'm going to change my behavior, to crisis, I've got to change right now. We've basically adopted that human psychology for business. So if you think about the satisfied on the left, this is someone who's going to be telling you how great their current supplier is. Neutral would be characterized by obviously really not saying much one way or the other. Aware is a person who's recognized this topic, this situation you're talking about or writing about happens to people like me, the directors of manufacturing, CFOs. I recognize my fellow professionals experience this type of thing. I'm not ready to admit I'm not sure that I have it yet. Concern is characterized by the customer acknowledges this is happening. I am experiencing shortness of breath. We do have a very long sales cycle. We are experiencing a high percentage, an increased percentage of no decisions. I wonder how bad it is. And that takes us to the next stage, critical, where you're working with your customer to help them determine the financial impact of the absence of your solution. And if it's bad enough for a business, we're going to make the change. We're going to invest. And that's basically what the crisis is. We decide we're going to look at a solution. So are your tools basically set up to address each of these stages? Aware stage would be that 7 early warning signals of the problem. Concern is they recognize those signals. Critical is the ability to measure and calculate the consequences of the absence of your solution. And if you overlay these two, you're looking at the progression to change running from the positive present upper left satisfied to the negative present lower right. I'm very frustrated. I need to change. What can you do to help me? So let's talk about the last item here, value leakage. And the major point I want to make here is most companies do not understand the full value impact of their solution. And these are 9 different clients that we've worked with recently, and they're all very sophisticated companies, the medical devices, Boston Scientific, the industrial chemicals, Georgia Pacific, jet engines was Rolls-Royce. And basically what they found is their business case, their ROI models were capturing less than 10% of the total financial impact that their solutions had on their respective customers. And if you want to think about that or look at it in a little detail, I won't spend a lot of time here. You can review it when you look at the slides later. But essentially, if we looked at the client's ROI model, the business case they had, this was the original amount, the column on the left. The next column showed the amount of value that was quantified after they went through our certified value process. And the percentages represent the amount of their total value that was understood by the customer through the business cases presented at the point they were looking for a decision. And the average you can see is under 10%. So if you really think about someone only understands 10% of the value they're going to receive, it's quite predictable that that would be a point of no decision. They're not seeing enough of what they actually could accomplish as a general result here. Now, how do you get from 10% of the value to 100% of the value? And it's really looking at value in different dimensions. So the first dimension we want to talk about here is the product dimension. And so you're seeing the shadow representing the 9.7% average of quantified value. But most people understand the product, what the product does. It's this fast, it needs this amount of maintenance, and so there are many tangible financial impacts that are usually present in the business case. The second level or dimension of value we talk about being the process level. Now here we're talking about the processes in your customer's business that are affected by your solution. And what we see companies doing really well is, let's call it the landing process or the installed process. In other words, your solution might go directly into a particular process, and we usually measure well the changes in that process and the financial impact of those changes. But there's a large indirect effect. For example, if you change process B, can the customer change something in process A or process C downstream from it? The answer is typically yes, but most of our analysis, most of our business cases do not include what we call that ripple effect of value throughout the organization. And then the final dimension of value is the performance level. And this is really the business impact to the organization, the high-level goals, the market share, the profit, the revenue, and return on investment, and so forth. And so it's expanding your view of value to look at these different dimensions. You'll find yourselves moving from what you believe is the total value impact today to a more thorough portrayal of that value. And I suppose that it's an interesting question just based on what we've talked about briefly here. What do you think the current level of value you have captured within your marketing tools and business cases that you're equipping your salespeople to go out and basically reproduce that story, that interaction with the customer? Any thoughts on that? We could enter them in the chat box.
Yeah, well, we have some people putting that in the chat box. You know, I've got a couple questions. We've got a question from the audience that asks, what are some of the tools to help companies better understand the total economic value delivered to customers and thus reduce value leakage when customers aren't forthcoming with information? So that was an audience question, and maybe you could take that while we look for these percentages to come in on the chat box.
Well, if you think of the tools, I'm gonna start at the basic with the fishbone diagram, sort of a decision tree. And so if you think about your customer, your solution on the right side of that decision tree, and then moving back to the left, saying, okay, what are some of the symptoms that we would expect to see in the absence of our solution? So if you take a benefit from your solution, a value from your solution, and say, if that's not here, what's happening? And it might be customer retention is lowered, or it might be manufacturing costs, you know, all of those types of items. And if the symptom is we're producing less items per day, the symptoms are we're having less retention of our mobile phone customers and so forth. So you have your value, then you have the symptom that they would expect to see in the absence of your value. Then you're going in to see, well, what would be the consequences of that? Okay, so if it's a lost customer, there's lost revenue. Then it's how many customers are we losing, what's the average revenue, and you're basically going through a manual calculation at its simplest level to do that. Now back to the point of tools, There are very sophisticated tools where you can, well, obviously the Excel spreadsheet is a tool that allows you to capture these calculations. And if the number of calculations becomes really large and the visibility into where did you get that particular number becomes really important, we've gone to these simulation type tools where you can basically manage a massive amount of data and information and make it very simple for the sales professional and the customer to navigate through, to look at those. So that's
I know we're getting
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that sounds great. I know we're getting a little close to the end of our time together, Jeff, and I know there's a couple more things you want to discuss, so maybe we should make sure we get through I know you want to get some other items as well.
Yeah, we'll do that. And I'm going to, just the last thing I want to take you through is sort of a sequence of value. We refer to it as the value life cycle or the value clarity life cycle. But fundamentally, obviously, to get paid for the value you create, the customer is going to have to believe they're absent that value and they're going to receive it from your solution. So if you think about sort of a standard sales process, and we talk about the 4 Ds, discover, diagnose, design, deliver, and a brief agenda for each stage. But what I want to walk you through is the evolution of value. Again, thinking about this as a decision process, not a sales process. All organizations have value propositions. And, you know, the word value proposition was coined by an ex-McKinsey consultant, Michael Lanning, back in 1984. And he really defined it as a combination of resulting experiences or outcomes. And I think, unfortunately, what happened over the years is the value proposition really became sort of a declaration of value. Here is our solution. Here's why it's valuable. More characteristics of the solution described than characteristics of the customer's experience. So here's the flow we're talking about. Think of your value proposition as a statement of a capability of your solution. It's like the drug Lipitor. It has a capability of reducing cholesterol in someone with high cholesterol and is willing to take it every day. So there are some conditions to that value being received. The actual Lipitor pill in the palm of your hand has no value. The value only exists inside the customer, the patient. So what we're suggesting is during that early engagement stage, you create what we call a value hypothesis, which is basically taking the proposition, looking at a specific prospect, looking at some evidence that we see in that specific prospect, and suggesting because we see that evidence, they may be at risk. And when we've seen it in other customers their size, it's had this percentage of revenue, this percentage of manufacturing costs, one of those types of items, and extrapolated to their business, it looks like $3 to $4 million per year. And what you're saying to your customer is, based on this bit of evidence, would it make sense for us to get together to look at it more closely? Now, back to your question about the attractiveness of ERA 3, we're finding our clients getting a 90-plus acceptance rate from senior executives for that appointment based on that value hypothesis premise to engage. So now, we're in meeting with the senior executive, and what we're offering to the senior executive is we will go down in the organization with the tools we have, and we will diagnose the processes in your organization, and we'll come back with a number that basically is the cost of the problem, the value at risk. And the question to the executive at that point, is that enough incentive to make a change? Where does that fit on your business priorities? And if it's high on the priority list, we then move to the next phase, which is designing the solution, and value further enhances to the amount of value expected to be achieved by the solution. So you think when the customer has a belief in the value that's at risk, the major question is how much of this value would you like to recover and how soon would you like to recover it? And that question is answered during the design stage where we create the solution in collaboration with the customer, get the customer's organization aligned around this is going to work. We are going to achieve this value. And it might not be 100%, it seldom is 100% of the value at risk, but now the customer team, the executives have the confidence to invest, and we move to deliver or install, and the value is obviously being achieved during the implementation, and it's being measured very accurately because recall during the diagnosis we had data from the various processes. Basically you're starting as is state defined, and now we're making the measurements. What has changed in those processes, those measurements, to measure the value that has been achieved? So the customer is now making the decision on the success that they've accomplished here. So I think that kind of covers, Kristen, what I wanted to get accomplished today. So if we have
great,
time for any other questions.
Yeah, I think we're, do you have a slide you wanted to mention some resources, Jeff?
Certainly. So let's go back. That will be in the deck as far as if anyone's interested in carrying forward any additional questions. And if we still have the questions on the line, Kristen, after we go off the air, I'll go through that and make sure we've gotten everyone answered.
Yeah, and then maybe you want to share a little bit of some of your books that you have, and then I can just let people know how we'll be able to get to questions that we weren't able to get to through the course of the presentation, and remind them where they can find this information.
Yes, so the three books that I have out, we've been talking about Mastering the Complex Sale, but basically the prime solution is about the strategy and how to close this value gap we've been talking about, and there's quite a bit about marketing in that particular book. Mastering the Complex Sale is about the overall process and having the internal team of marketing, sales, pre-sales, customer success management, so forth, working together. And then exceptional selling is about the mindset and the one-to-one communication skills for executing the process.
Great. Well, I just would like to thank everybody for participating today. Really enjoyed the audience interaction and a lot of great questions we got throughout the course of today's presentation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but Jeff, I appreciate your offer to help go through those notes that we've got in our system here and make sure that we get your questions answered offline. I'd also like to just give everybody a quick reminder that a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will be available at pragmaticmarketing.com/live starting tomorrow, and you will also receive an email with a link to that recording as well. And then finally, I just want to remind everybody we do these webinars on a monthly basis, and we hope you'll join us next month. We're going to tackle a presentation called The Key to Building Better Products from Peter Hughes, who's a UX/UI expert. And I think that about does it for today. So again, thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.